I've only got a few questions for you, Frank.
Mm.
So I'm aware that you've been doing online performances to
Yeah.
raise money for independent and grassroots music venues,
Yeah.
like on the 3rd of December last
Mm.
week. Could you tell us a bit about why you started doing these online gigs and what made you want to do it in the first place?
Well, in March this year, I was in the middle of a tour of the UK with, it was a solo tour, but it was me, it was my wife, and then some American friends of mine, Micah Schnabel, who's a singer, and Vanessa Jean Speckman, who's an artist. So the four of us were on tour with my crew, obviously, as well. And the news filtered through, and initially we ignored it like everybody else did, and then suddenly somebody found the off switch for society and it was locked down all the way. And the very first thing that happened was that, I had to cancel the end of the tour, and I went home and found myself at home with my American friends and obviously with my wife. And we had a few days of, it was a very strange time, trying to rebook my American friends' flights home so they could get home before the borders closed and all this sort of thing. But among other things, we were at home, and it was like, it having been a solo acoustic tour, it was just like, well, why don't we do the show that we would have done tonight on the internet? I mean, I've got an internet connection, I've got a laptop, and we didn't use any fancy microphones or anything like that. We just sort of played. And I think it's funny, in retrospect, I feel like I sort of accidentally caught a bit of a wave there, in the sense that I feel like I was one of the first people to do that kind of thing. Now I feel like I've done a million, and a lot of people have done them, and I feel quite strongly like we're entering a period of live streaming fatigue generally. But back then it was kind of exciting, and we got about 13,000 people tuned in, which was incredible. And the first one I did as a fundraiser for my immediate touring family, my band and my crew, because it was instantly obvious to me that they were going to suffer extremely during a lockdown situation. I mean, I've suffered financially too, but I have income from merchandise and songwriting royalties and that kind of thing, and a lot of my touring family don't have those extra streams of income. So it seemed like the least I could do would be to try and help out. So we did it as a fundraiser, and we raised an eye-poppingly large amount of money, which I distributed among everybody, and it was kind of cool. It felt like a positive use of my time, and that sort of established a model and a pattern, and we went from there.
Amazing. I think what you've been doing is really, really good.
Thank you.
So how important have these gigs been in raising money and awareness to the importance of these venues, and why are these venues so important?
Well, I've been working with the Music Venue Trust and Independent Venue Week for a few years now, which goes to show that running an independent venue is not exactly a particularly kind of glorious task, even when there's not a global pandemic going on. They require, activist organizations to back up the sector. And the Music Venue Trust in particular has done unbelievable work in the last 5 years of highlighting the issue, and I've tried to lend a hand where I can. And the reason for that is multifaceted. I mean, the most basic part of it is just that's where I built my career. I think this is true of most artists to some extent, but for me particularly, I built my career live by just touring and touring and touring and touring. And you have to have somewhere to play, particularly if the art you're making is noisy. You can't just do it anywhere. There's got to be a place with the required technical and legal and all the rest of it set up for it to happen. So, all the independent venues that are on the MVT's list of kind of grassroots independent venues, like I would say the vast majority of them I've played at least once, if not many, many times. So I feel a debt of gratitude. When you get into the more kind of like rehearsed PR lines about this, everybody always says, well, you've got Adele and Radiohead and Ed Sheeran and George Ezra and Muse and all these bands you can think of that came up through the independent circuit. And that is true, and it's part of the reason why, if you want to have well-developed and interesting music at the kind of arena level, those artists need to have somewhere to germinate and to develop their art and to develop their audience. That is true. I always feel duty-bound to say that there is another aspect to this, which is that there's a lot of weird, obscure, noisy, underground music which only exists in underground venues and isn't going to go on to be an arena success, and is no less valid because of that. Many of my favorite bands will never play to more than 200 people, and that's fine, and they need a place to exist. So again, after I'd done the crew one, it was just like I was sort of thinking, well, I could do more of these live streams and as fundraisers. And I was chatting with some friends of mine who run a bar called Nambuka, where I actually used to live 15 years ago, and they were, again, screwed by the pandemic, should we say, because If you make your living gathering people together in a confined space, that's not a good idea during a pandemic, and it's just very, very hard at that point in time. So I did a fundraiser for Nambucca, and it went really, really well. And that on that occasion, I played my first album in full, and then that presents an obvious path forward from there. But I mean, it's not really for me to say directly how important this has been to the venues I've done it for. I mean, we averaged between £10,000 and £15,000 per venue. I did 16 venues. I mean, I will say that like Pippa, who runs the Cavern in Exeter, which is a venue that I love and that I've been playing for 18 years now, she's an old friend, and she sent me a lovely message saying that, you know, basically the only reason they survived this year was because of the fundraiser that I did for them. And that made me feel good because, first of all, I love that place. And secondly, there are bands being formed now who need the Cavern in the future in order to win over the Southwest. You know, if that's how it works.
Yeah. So you'd say that these venues have actually been very crucial to yourself coming up as an artist yourself.
Very much so. I mean, as I sort of alluded to this earlier, it's a place where, as an artist, where first of all you can figure out who you are. You know, like very few artists arrive in this world fully formed. Some do, and good for them. But like most people have to kind of knock themselves into shape, and you do a fair amount of that in your bedroom, writing songs, or indeed in the studio if you're lucky enough to have the budget to do that. But an awful lot of it's going to happen by just playing a lot of shows. You know, that's how you figure out your art, what you're trying to say and how you're trying to say it. And then as a corollary to that, there's the part where you figure out who it is who's going to listen to that, you know, and you find your first round of people who are interested in the noise that you're making. And, you know, as I say, not necessarily, but if you do then go on to bigger things, it's all built on that first layer of people who came to see you in the small venues. And so, yeah, they're absolutely, I mean, I would have no career without these places.
Wow. You've answered them really great so far. Thank you. I was listening to a song from your album, England Keep My Bones. It's called I Still Believe. Some of the lyrics in there I thought were quite touching, maybe quite prevalent to now. There's a line in there saying, and I still believe in the need for guitars and drums and desperate poetry. And you said at the end, you know, it's about rock and roll that saves us. Can you tell me a little bit about that song and whether you think it's true that rock and roll can save?
Yeah, I mean, the line in the song, rock and roll, it's about saving souls, is obviously sort of slightly kind of deliberately over the top, and I'm not sure that I literally believe that rock and roll will save the world. But it's certainly made my life meaningful in a way that nothing else has done, and I think that's true for a lot of people. I wrote that song after I did a underground sort of slightly illegal tour of China in 2010, and by which I mean I didn't have permission or visas or anything, and I just kind of walked over the border with a tourist visa and then played a bunch of squat shows, which was an incredible, it was an unbelievable experience.
Yeah.
One of the things that I noticed on that tour was that because of the history of China, it was a period of time where Chinese youth were kind of getting very into rock and roll, using that term in the broadest sense possible. And it was all new for them. And I grew up in a culture where you hear rock songs on car adverts and in shops and on TV shows. And it's pretty ubiquitous and it saturates the culture. And what that means is that you can grow up and you can be a little bit blasé about the whole thing. Do you know what I mean? It's just kind of there. It's background noise to a degree. If you focus on it, I mean, I as I have done, and try and make it your career and your passion, your life, and all the rest of it, that's fine. But, you know, you still take it for granted to quite a large degree. And on that Chinese tour, what was amazing to me was the people I was meeting in China had literally, in some cases, only in the last 6 months discovered that if you play this chord, followed by this chord, followed by this chord, and play it fast, and then your guitar's turned up and you have a drummer hit things, and then you shout over the top of it, it makes people push each other over in a mosh pit. And do you know what I mean? There was this kind of like this freshness and this excitement and this electricity to the musicians that I was sharing a stage with out there, which I just found completely redemptive. You know, it was just amazing seeing these bands, and it was so punk, you know, and it was so rock and roll, and it just really blew me away, and it made me feel slightly kind of chastened. You know, it was like, oh, I should be more appreciative of this wonderful, wonderful art form, which is my life. And so that was the basis for the start of the song. I feel like in 2020, this most miserable of years for live music, there is one silver lining. And you've got to be careful talking about silver linings because the cloud is very large and people have suffered and died and people have lost their jobs and the economy is screwed and all the rest of it. But one silver lining is I do feel like people have stopped taking a lot of art for granted, you know, because they, partly because you don't know what you got till it's gone, as Joni Mitchell says, but also it's that thing of like, one of the things about live streaming that I've noticed is it pinpoints in an extremely focused way why live music's amazing. Because it's like, well, I'm still playing and people are still watching it as it happens and this doesn't feel the same. And why doesn't it feel the same? And the answer is because you haven't got that physical communitarian sense of a group of strangers coming together into a room and intermingling and losing themselves in the crowd and that exchange of energy in a room, you know, between a performer and an audience, and that feeling that a show happens once in one place and can't ever be repeated, and it's beautifully ephemeral and all this sort of thing. So this is a thing. As and when we return to massive quotes normal, and whether we will or when we will is still an open question as far as I'm concerned. But as and when I play a show in a 300 cap room that's crammed to the gills with people stage diving and all the rest of it, I feel like both I and the audience will be a lot more appreciative of how magic that is at that point. And it's not that I've not been appreciative in my life. I mean, as I keep saying, it's the basis of my existence. But it's like, just right now, I had a conversation with a friend of mine a little while ago, and he said that just before, he works in the music industry, and he said that just before lockdown came in, and so before he knew lockdown was coming in, somebody said, do you want to go and see this band, a band that he quite likes? And he said, nah, you know, I had a long week. I've seen a lot of gigs this year already. I'll give it a miss. They'll be around again soon enough and all this kind of thing. And he said that now he's like, I will go and see any band in any venue. I just miss it. And that's true for me as well. And like, you know, I think, so that's it. I think that the sentiment of the song Still Believe might apply more readily to our culture now than it did before the pandemic.
So you're a bit of a yes man now then. If someone says, do you want to perform here? Yeah, because you don't want to miss out on the
I mean, to be honest, that has been the battle plan in my career to a degree. I mean, in the early days, I just played everywhere. I played every single gig anyone offered, and I ended up playing some very, very strange places, quite often to no people. I remember playing on a shelf above a bar in Belgium once, and no one could actually see the stage. I was literally above the audience. It was completely pointless. You know, and I've played squats and I've played rooftops and I've played car parks and so on and so forth. And indeed, younger artists, I mean, that's a thing I always say, just say yes to every gig until you don't need to do it that way anymore, but just play. Obviously, that's not brilliant advice, not useful advice right now. No. But yeah, you know, I mean, there's definitely one of the things this year which I found very interesting is there has been a sense of kind of returning to first principles for me, in the sense that one of the things about a live stream is I don't have my band and I don't have a fancy mixing desk and a PA and all this kind of thing. It's just me and a guitar, and it's like, can you do it? And I don't mean this to sound bitchy, but it's going to sound bitchy, but like, there are some people who have not been doing this kind of thing, one suspects because they struggle with that kind of, that completely leveled format. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's no frills, there's no guitar tech, there's no sound guy, there's no auto tune, there's no track playing in the background. Can you sit down with an instrument in front of your phone and do a performance? And I'm sort of pleasantly surprised and relieved even to discover that I still can.
It's good. It's going back to the roots, isn't it? It's how
exactly. Yeah.
Getting rid of all the showbiz, and it's just you at your core. You did touch on new musicians saying yes to everything. I was going to ask as well, and what would you say to musicians that have maybe just graduated from music school, or they're in little bands, they've now obviously had to take a back seat, they can't do what they wanted to do. What would you say to those musicians?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that, like, in many ways, the experience of 2020 and the pandemic has been easier for me because I was somebody who had an established career before all this happened. And the great tragedy of this year, in many ways, to my mind, is those bands who were sort of just on the cusp of making their mark on the world in January 2020. Let's say somebody who had a good slot at South by Southwest 2020, and that's gone. And I think that's heartbreaking, and I really feel for those people. I guess the one thing I would say is that, you know, my experience of life in the music industry over the last 20 years has coincided with the internet's impact on the music industry, which kind of drove a horse and cart through the middle of an old business model. And there has been a lot of kind of moaning about that. And I actually think that's misplaced in the sense that I don't really care about business models. I care about music. Do you know what I mean? And actually, one of the things I've noticed in my time is that the internet is quite anarchic in a way that I really enjoy, in the sense that there's not many rules and people don't really understand what's going on anymore. And the kind of structures of authority that used to exist, as in you had to get signed by an A&R guy from a major label, aren't really there anymore. And we've seen bands like the Arctic Monkeys, are a great example of this, who just kind of like arrived and were brilliant and the world had to catch up. And Gallows, for example, even Idols, you know, if you make a great noise, then people will come running to you because you can just sort of, you have much more autonomy now. And I think that it continues to be true. And I think that, you know, during this year, we've seen a really interesting process of people using technology in new and innovative ways out of necessity, you know, and I started off doing basic live streams, and I kind of still do for the most part. I've got a full band live stream coming out, which will be a more fancy affair, should we say, technically. But like already there's people, you know, I know there are people being setting up subscription models and doing kind of more like a kind of chat show type vibe or whatever, their friends, or doing, you know, alphabet covers or whatever. Like people have been throwing up these really, really cool and interesting ideas and building on the basic principle and using technology in innovative ways. And I think that's really exciting. So for new bands, I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of like courage, tough it out, try and last until you can play shows again. But also, yeah, think outside the box, come up with a way of using the internet that nobody else is currently doing, or use a way that somebody else can't do it, take it and improve it, do it better, and make your mark that way. And it's an interesting challenge.